at the architecture of almost any university or research institution, there's this very specific, rigid layout to human knowledge.
Oh, absolutely.
You walk down the science wing, and the door on the left says physics, the door on the right is biology, and then sequestered somewhere down in the basement is chemistry.
Hmm.
We have this intense urge to just, box the universe up into neat, isolated silos.
Right, and it goes way deeper than just categorization. We actually build our academic institutions and our funding models around that exact flaw, which is, it's why the notes and diagrams we're unpacking in today's deep dive on integrated science are so disruptive.
Yeah.
The core premise here is just that the universe, it doesn't respect our departmental boundaries.
Which is exactly why today we are completely throwing out the boxes.
Yeah.
We're looking at a really comprehensive stack of source material that basically acts as the ultimate rule book for
Yeah.
We're looking at a really comprehensive stack of source material that basically acts as the ultimate rule book for reality. And the mission here is to trace the continuous, unbroken journey of matter and energy. So for you listening, we want to track how a single atom can sit inside a solid piece of rock, get swept up into a global weather pattern, be hijacked by a plant's plumbing system, and eventually fuel the living, breathing machine that is your own body.
It's quite the itinerary. But to even begin that journey, we have to establish the foundational rules of the physical world. And really, the only way we've been able to map those rules is through the scientific method.
Right.
But rather than just listing, observation and hypothesis as abstract concepts, it's worth noting that this is fundamentally an epistemological tool. It's how we prevent ourselves from being fooled by random chance.
I always visualize the scientific method through the lens of high-end baking, which is honestly just edible chemistry.
That's a great way to look at it.
Right. Like if a pastry chef is trying to perfect a croissant and it comes out completely dense, the observation isn't just, well, this failed. The hypothesis has to isolate a single variable. Maybe the ambient humidity interfered with the yeast fermentation?
So the experiment then is to bake the exact same recipe in a climate-controlled room.
Exactly.
And if they're treating their kitchen like a true laboratory, they're also observing rigorous safety protocols. So, aprons, proper handling of thermal reactions, and strictly limiting contamination.
Absolutely. Then comes the analysis of that second batch.
Yeah.
If the croissants are airy and perfectly laminated, the conclusion is that humidity disrupts that specific leavening process.
Right.
It's a systematic elimination of variables.
Right.
But to isolate those variables, whether you're manipulating yeast in a bakery or synthesizing chemicals in a lab, you need a universally agreed upon standard for measurement.
And that is exactly the role of SI units. Having standard meters for length, kilograms for mass, and seconds for time allows us to calculate the complex properties that actually dictate how the world operates. Density is a perfect example here. It isn't just some trivial calculation of, mass divided by volume. When we look at relative density, which is comparing a substance's density directly to the density of water, we're looking at the fundamental math of planetary engineering.
Because relative density dictates buoyancy.
Yes.
It is the sole reason an aircraft carrier made of tens of thousands of tons of heavy steel can actually float. The physical architecture of the ship displaces a volume of water that weighs more than the ship itself.
Exactly. And that underlying math scales all the way down to the microscopic building blocks of those materials.
Yeah.
The smallest unit of an element is an atom, and it retains all the properties of that element.
Yep.
And then when you start chemically bonding different elemental atoms together, you get compounds like water, H2O. But the source material highlights a really specific unit of measurement used to quantify these microscopic interactions called the mole.
Okay, wait, I have to stop you at the mole because I was looking at this in the notes, and the number is just astronomically huge.
It is.
It's 6.0, 2 times 10 to the 23rd particles. That is a 6 with 23 zeros behind it. From a practical standpoint, why create a unit of measurement so massively scaled that it's fundamentally incomprehensible to the human brain?
That's a fair question.
If we can already weigh things in grams, why do we need this arbitrary cosmic baker's dozen?
Well, because grams don't tell you how many reactive participants you actually have in a beaker. The human brain can't visualize individual atoms, and obviously a scientist can't count them with tweezers.
Fair enough.
The mole isn't meant to be visualized. It's a mathematical translation tool. It basically acts as the bridge between the invisible quantum world of atoms and the macroscopic world we can actually measure on a lab scale.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it guarantees that if you have 1 mole of carbon and 1 mole of oxygen, you have the exact same number of atoms of each ready to react.
Okay, that reframes it perfectly. It's like a matching system for chemical reaction. And all of those reactions are bound by the ultimate physical constraint, right? The law of conservation of energy, meaning energy cannot be created or destroyed. It only changes form.
Right.
Like when you plug in a kettle, you aren't creating heat out of nothing. You are forcing electrical energy through a resistance to manifest as thermal energy.
And we have engineered our entire modern civilization around manipulating that specific conversion. I mean, electronics is simply the mastery of controlling electron flow through complete circuits. We use discrete components to act as basically traffic signals. Resistors bottleneck the current to prevent overloads. Capacitors act as temporary reservoirs to store and release charge precisely when needed.
Right.
And light-emitting diodes, or LEDs, they exploit the physics of semiconductors to release photons converting electrical flow directly into light.
Wow. And the mechanics of electron flow and energy conservation, they don't just power our circuit boards, they power the entire planet.
They really do.
If we apply these atomic and energetic rules to a planetary scale, the Earth itself is basically a giant slow-motion recycling plant.
That's a great analogy.
Take the literal ground beneath us. The rock cycle is this continuous engine of transformation. You have igneous rocks cooling from raw magma. And then, over immense timescales, weathering mechanically breaks them apart, and the fragments get pressed into sedimentary rock.
And then, if those sedimentary plates get dragged deep underground by tectonic forces, the staggering heat and pressure physically and chemically rewrite their structure entirely, turning them into metamorphic rock.
And the primary engine driving the weathering of those rocks up on the surface is water.
Always water.
The hydrological cycle, evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and collection. It isn't just moving moisture around. Water is a universal solvent. Because of its molecular shape, it essentially tears other molecules apart.
Which is the exact mechanism behind what we call hard water.
Oh, well.
As water moves through the hydrological cycle and filters down through the earth, it aggressively dissolves and carries the local geology with it, specifically minerals like calcium and magnesium.
Right, which makes it a pain to wash dishes in.
Exactly. It's perfectly safe to drink, but chemically, those dissolved minerals bind with the fatty acids in soup, which is why hard water just refuses to lather. To remove those geological hitchhikers and any pathogens, we have to intervene with purification mechanics like chemical chlorination, physical filtration, or just thermal boiling.
And water's thermal properties also dictate the movement of our atmosphere, right? Because water has a super high heat capacity, it absorbs and releases temperature much slower than solid land does.
Yep.
This differential heating is the engine for global wind patterns. During the day, the land superheats, the air above it rises, and the cooler ocean air rushes in, and that creates a sea breeze.
And then at night, the whole thermodynamic engine flips.
Right. The land bleeds off its heat rapidly while the ocean stays warm, reversing the flow into a land breeze.
And when you scale those temperature and pressure differentials way up, you get massive atmospheric mechanics like cyclones, where air is just violently dragged into these spinning low-pressure vortexes.
But the atmosphere is also our armor. We have two very different chemical shields operating above us. You have the greenhouse effect, where gases like carbon dioxide act as an insulating blanket, trapping solar heat.
Right, which we need.
We absolutely need a baseline greenhouse effect to keep the planet habitable. But pumping excess carbon into the system throws the thermodynamics way out of balance, which drives global warming.
And then you have the ozone layer, which is a high-altitude concentration of O3 molecules that physically intercepts and absorbs tissue-damaging ultraviolet radiation from the sun.
And this is where human engineering created just a spectacular irony.
Oh, yeah.
For decades, we manufactured chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. We used them as refrigerants and aerosol propellants just to make our domestic lives slightly more convenient. But we didn't account for how those molecules would behave in the upper atmosphere. We essentially weaponized a chemical to keep our leftovers cold, and in doing so, systematically dismantled the planet's UV shield.
It is a profound example of that interconnectedness we started with. Every chemical action demands a reaction. And you see this environmental feedback loop so vividly in the pH scale, which it measures the concentration of hydrogen ions to determine acidity or alkalinity from 0 to 14.
Yeah, the actual numbers on the scale are almost less important than the spectrum of reactivity they represent.
Exactly.
Like on the extreme acidic end, closer to 0, you have compounds like hydrochloric acid, which your stomach uses to literally dismantle the proteins you eat.
It's powerful stuff.
Moving up the acidic side, you find the sharp tartness of lemons around a 2, apples and vinegar at a 3. And then neutral sits right in the middle at 7, perfectly balancing pure water in human blood.
Then you cross the threshold into alkaline or basic territory. This ranges from the mild basicity of baking soda at a 9, up through the soapy molecular structures of cleaning agents, all the way to industrial drain cleaners near 14.
Which are terrifying.
They are. They're so aggressively alkaline, they just liquefy fats and organic blockages.
What's vital for you, the listener, to realize here is that pH isn't just confined to test tubes or your digestive tract.
No, not at all.
When industrial exhaust pumps pollutants into the sky, it chemically alters the condensation in the clouds. That shifts the rain's pH toward the acidic side.
Right.
Acid rain falls back down, accelerating the weathering of the igneous and sedimentary rocks we discussed earlier, and altering the entire mineral content of the hydrological cycle.
Which directly impacts the next major phase of our exploration, life.
Mm-hmm.
The chemistry of the soil and water must be within a very narrow pH tolerance for organic matter to actually thrive.
And biologists use a very rigid set of criteria to determine if something has crossed the threshold from mere chemistry into actual life, spanning the 5 kingdoms from single-celled Monera and Protista up to fungi, plantae, and animalia.
Yes.
The sources note this acronym used to define life. Mr. Nigerad. I have to admit, as a mnemonic device, it's a bit unwieldy.
It might lack elegance, sure, but the criteria it outlines are absolutely non-negotiable for biological systems.
Sure.
Movement, respiration, nutrition, irritability, meaning the capacity to detect and respond to environmental stimuli. Then growth, excretion, reproduction, adaptation, and eventually death.
Right.
If an entity maintains all of those processes, it operates as a living system.
And the fundamental operating unit of that system is the cell. Cells are essentially microscopic factories, and their most critical function is division. But they don't all divide the same way, right?
Right, there are 2 main types. Mitosis is the mechanism for growth and maintenance. A cell duplicates its entire genetic code and splits into 2 identical clones. Like, if you fracture a bone or scrape your skin, mitosis is the mechanical process repairing that damage.
Meiosis, conversely, is exclusively an engine for variation and reproduction.
Okay.
It produces 4 cells, but intentionally halves the genetic payload in each, ensuring that when they combine with another organism's cells, the resulting offspring is a completely novel genetic mix, which drives adaptation.
But, a factory is useless if materials can't move in and out of it.
Exactly.
At the cellular level, this transport is governed by gradient thermodynamics. Diffusion is the passive movement of particles seeking equilibrium, spreading from areas of high concentration to low.
Like smelling perfume across a room.
Yes. And osmosis is the same principle, but strictly concerning the movement of water across a semi-permeable boundary, like a cell wall. And nowhere is this cellular transport more critical to global survival than in the plantae kingdom. Plants serve as the absolute baseline for all ecological webs because they possess the chemical machinery to harvest solar radiation directly.
Photosynthesis is arguably the most important chemical reaction on the planet.
Yeah.
I mean, the sheer audacity of it is incredible.
It really is magic.
Plants use tiny pores in their leaves, called stomata, to literally inhale carbon dioxide gas from the air. They pull water up from the dirt. The chloroplasts catch passing photons of sunlight, and they use that solar energy to smash the water and carbon dioxide together, forging physical, energy-dense glucose sugars while venting oxygen as a waste product.
It's amazing.
They're literally building their physical mass out of thin air and sunshine.
And once they synthesize those sugars, the internal logistics to distribute them are highly specialized.
Yeah, I picture the inside of a plant like the service shafts of a massive skyscraper. You have 2 distinct plumbing systems. The xylem is the water main. It utilizes extreme pressure gradients to pull water up from the roots in the basement against gravity all the way to the canopy.
Right.
And then parallel to that, you have the phloem, which is the food delivery network, transporting the newly minted glucose sugars down from the leaves to feed the rest of the structure.
To perpetuate those structures, plants rely on mechanical reproduction. Pollen must be physically transferred from the male anther to the female stigma, which is pollination.
Okay.
Once the pollen grain fuses with the ovule, fertilization occurs, locking the entire genetic blueprint into a seed. But for that seed to execute its programming and undergo germination, it requires a strict environmental triad: water, oxygen, and warmth.
The sources offer a much better acronym for that.
Yeah, much easier to remember.
But even if a seed has the perfect temperature and moisture, it can't build cellular structures without raw materials from the soil. Fertility hinges on crucial elements like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium NPK, and this highlights one of the most fascinating paradoxes in nature. Nitrogen is the critical building block for proteins and DNA. The atmosphere we breathe is roughly 78% nitrogen gas, yet plants can't process atmospheric nitrogen.
No, they can't. They're essentially starving in a sea of plenty. The gaseous nitrogen molecule is bonded so tightly that plants just can't break it apart.
So how does the nitrogen actually get into the food chain?
By relying on the invisible workforce in the dirt, microscopic bacteria, often living symbiotically in the roots of legumes, possess the specific enzymes required to fix gaseous nitrogen, converting it into solid nitrates that plant roots can actually absorb.
Wow.
Without this single-celled bacteria doing the heavy lifting at the microscopic level, the primary producers, the grasses and plants, would fail. And if the producers fail, the entire flow of energy upward to the primary consumers, like insects, and secondary consumers, like amphibians or mammals, collapses entirely.
So the apex of the food web is completely tethered to the chemical byproducts of bacteria.
It entirely is.
Which brings us to the most complex processing plants on that food web, the mammalian machine. You, the listener, require a constant influx of this converted environmental energy.
And the architecture of mammalian digestion is entirely dependent on the diet. In agriculture, we observe ruminant animals like cattle and sheep.
Right, the ones that chew the cud.
Exactly. Because grass and roughage are incredibly tough to break down, their digestive tracts feature massive multi-chambered stomachs designed to ferment and repeatedly process cellulose.
Hello.
Non-ruminants, including poultry, swine, and humans, utilize a more streamlined, single-chambered stomach geared toward a varied, easily digestible diet.
And for the human machine to function, that diet must strike a very precise chemical balance.
Yeah.
Carbohydrates provide immediate combustible energy. Proteins supply the amino acids required for that mitosis and tissue repair we mentioned earlier. Fats provide thermal insulation and energy storage. Vitamins and minerals act as chemical catalysts for immune protection, and fiber provides the mechanical bulk necessary to keep the whole digestive tract moving.
When that chemical balance fails, the machine degrades quickly. A chronic lack of vitamin C arrests collagen production, resulting in scurvy.
Oh.
Depleting vitamin D and calcium compromises bone density, leading to the structural warping seen in rickets. A severe protein deficit causes kwashiorkor, fundamentally shutting down the body's ability to maintain its own tissues.
To extract those vital nutrients and avoid all that, digestion employs both physical destruction and chemical targeting.
Right.
It initiates the second food breaches the mouth. Your dentition is highly specialized. Incisors act as blades to shear food, canines tear fibrous material, and molars operate as grinding plates to maximize surface area.
Simultaneously, your salivary glands inundate the food with enzymes that begin breaking down complex starches before you even swallow.
The food then traverses the esophagus into the highly acidic environment of the stomach, where proteins are dismantled.
And as it passes into the small intestine, specifically the ileum, the microscopic villi absorb the molecular nutrients directly into the bloodstream.
It's an incredible assembly line.
It is, and it's supported by accessory organs. The liver, gallbladder, and pancreas inject specialized bile and enzymes to emulsify fats and neutralize those harsh stomach acids, leaving only the unusable waste to be compacted in the colon.
Once those nutrients actually reach your individual cells, the mitochondria utilize a process called respiration to combust them and trap the released energy in a molecule called ATP.
Right.
If oxygen is present, aerobic respiration occurs, which is highly efficient. But if you're in a dead sprint and your circulatory system can't supply oxygen fast enough, your muscles shift to anaerobic respiration.
Yeah, that's a fallback mechanism that generates energy without oxygen, very similar to the fermentation process used by yeast, though it leaves behind lactic acid.
All of these soft tissue logistics require a rigid framework to anchor against. The skeletal system is far more than mere scaffolding.
Oh, absolutely.
It provides the mechanical levers that muscles pull against to generate movement. It creates protective vaults for critical organs like the cranium shielding the brain or the ribs caging the heart and lungs.
But the skeleton isn't just structural, it's an active manufacturing hub. Inside the shafts of your longest bones, like the femur in your thigh, the marrow is constantly churning out the billions of red blood cells your circulatory system needs to transport oxygen.
It's a very dynamic piece of the machine. It features hinge joints in the knees and elbows for linear mechanics, and ball and socket joints in the hips and shoulders for multi-axis rotation.
However, running a complex, high-energy machine like this generates a staggering amount of metabolic waste.
Yeah, so that brings up a functional question. If the digestive tract handles the solid byproduct of what we eat, how does the body actually clear out the cellular exhaust from all this energy production? How does it handle the trash?
That falls to the excretory system, which operates four main disposal pathways. The lungs function as gas exhaust vents, continuously expelling the carbon dioxide generated during cellular respiration.
Okay.
The skin manages thermal regulation and waste through sweat, purging water, excess salts, and trace amounts of urea.
But the really heavy filtration is handled by the kidneys, right?
Yeah.
The renal arteries push high-pressure blood into the kidneys, which act as a chemical sieve, scrubbing out urea and balancing the blood's salt concentration. That filtered liquid waste then travels down the ureters to the bladder for physical expulsion.
And finally, the liver acts as the ultimate internal detox center. It neutralizes ingested poisons, but its most profound function ties right back to the skeletal system we just talked about.
Oh, right.
We noted that the bone marrow manufactures red blood cells. When those cells reach the end of their life cycle, it is the liver that dismantles them, recycling the iron and excreting the chemical remnants.
It is a perfectly closed-loop system. The body acts as its own recycling plant, constantly manufacturing, utilizing, and dismantling matter. The only threat to this equilibrium really comes from external pathogens. Bacteria can infiltrate and cause diseases like tuberculosis, though we can counter them with antibiotics. Viral agents like influenza or COVID-19 hijack our cellular machinery, requiring vaccines to train our immune responses. And protozoan parasites, like the ones transmitted by the Anopheles mosquito, introduce complex systemic disruptions like malaria.
The overarching lesson of integrated science is that protecting against those disruptions or understanding any facet of biology is really impossible without understanding the chemistry and physics that underpin it.
Yeah.
There are no actual walls separating these disciplines. They are simply different focal lengths for observing the exact same universal mechanics.
Which brings us to what this all means for you, listening right now. Think about the law of conservation we discussed at the very beginning, the absolute rule that matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed, only altered in form.
It's a profound thought.
The implications of that are just staggering. It means that every single atom currently constructing your bones, firing in your nervous system, or flowing through your bloodstream has a billion-year resume. Your carbon might have been locked inside a subterranean metamorphic rock for an eon. The hydrogen in your cells might have blown across the Pacific in a monsoon. The nitrogen building your DNA was almost certainly pulled from the sky by invisible bacteria and passed up through the roots of a plant.
It's all connected.
So when you look out the window at a rainstorm or a forest or a crumbling cliffside, you're not just an observer looking at an external environment. Because of the endless integrated recycling of the physical world, you are quite literally looking at the scattered pieces of your own deep past and eventually your own future.